Well, it's good to be back from vacation, and on a beautiful day when I know at least a number of people are playing hooky, and good for them. Monica, welcome back from your travels. Wayne, thank you very much for doing welcome and announcements. And Rick and Carol and Andy, thank you so much for being ushers, or usherettes, I'm sorry. One of you prefers usherettes, and I don't know about the other. Well, you're probably not an usherette, are you? Not yet. You're working on it, though. Okay. But thank you. You see, the nice thing about volunteering for these jobs is that they can be fun. And as I said a long time ago when I first got here, you're going to have fun. So this morning I'd like to talk about that fifth source, which is really about religious humanism. And I'm going to pose two questions. First of all, does religious humanism still have a value to us in the 21st century? And second, if so, does it need to be seen and experienced in new ways to be useful? In other words, can we adapt to changes? Now, what we read just a moment ago was humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. All right, well, what does that mean? Humanist teachings which counsel us arises out of the humanist movement of the early 20th century in the United States and, to some measure, Europe. Secular and religious humanism was an effort to divorce or at least separate out the perceived unity, if you will, of what humanists believe was supernatural or superstitious mythic understandings of reality, especially within religion, and to focus more on the use of reason and logic. Some of you know of the first Humanist Manifesto, which was published in 1933 and signed by many American intellectuals, among them a number of Unitarian ministers. This document was an effort to articulate what humanism meant as a religious movement in the 20th century. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it would be way too long, but the first three of this manifesto, I think, are important points. And I'll read them in sequence, noting, of course, that the language is a bit archaic. First, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. 2, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. 3, holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. I'm going to read those again. First, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Second, humanism believes that man is part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. Third, holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. Now, those and other statements in the Humanist Manifesto placed religious humanists firmly beyond the pale of religious faith in America. In fact, religious humanists were dismissed, and by the way, secular humanists too, we can't leave them out, were dismissed as liberal, anti-Christian, probably communists, anti-American, and just plain not very nice people. However, these and other points in the 80 or so years since the Humanist Manifesto have contributed to beliefs that are still unfolding in North America and in Europe particularly. Now, yes, many in the fundamentalist Christian community still believe that the creation, as described in the Hebrew Testament, Old Testament, actually happened that way. But if you talk to most mainstream religious people and those who are not religious, but more spiritual, will all agree that the universe is self-existing and was not created in 6 days. Evolution, in other words, is a given. The third assertion about non-dualism is actually still in process. Consider that Eastern traditions in the last 80 or so years, since the 1930s, have exploded in the Western world. And Eastern tradition primarily does not accept the idea of dualism. Eastern religious traditions primarily tie together mind and body, for example. It's a holistic view of what reality looks like. Hence, our seventh principle, speaking to the interdependent web of all existence, is a manifestation of non-dualism. So really, that third statement speaks to a holistic way of seeing the world. And I guarantee to you that every day you go into a bookstore and go to the self-help section, they're going to be speaking and reading about non-dualism. Now, the desire to have reason and science guide our religious seeking, as it says in that fifth source statement, it still carries a lot of weight with us, I think. And I suspect this is one reason why Buddhism, for example, is so sexy in Unitarian Universalist circles. It relies on reason, rational examination of thought, word, and deed, and best of all, there's no creator God to tell you what to do. How much better could you have it than that? And I think that many Unitarian Universalists and others are in love with Buddhism in particular because seeking answers to life's great questions, using logic, science, rational examination, well, forgive the pun, it makes sense. So I think the answer to the first question I pose is that, yes, religious humanism is still important today. Conditionally, however, as one of our 6 sources, knowing the other 5 are equally important. So if you came down on the side of this one source is more important than any of the others, okay, that's fair enough. You're entitled. But I would argue that they're all equally important, and you can leave none out. Now, this fifth source actually descended into some really delightful language to me. Warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. That's a beautiful statement. Now, a really fervent religious humanist might argue that the word spirit doesn't belong there, but we'll not go there. It's a poetic phrase, and it's a warning, really, to not become dependent or complacent in our beliefs. In fact, idolatries, which is a very nice word, idolatries, has several definitions. One is, it can mean worshiping false gods, and that's one option. But it can also, if you look it up, have excessive or blind devotion to something. So let's look at that phrase, excessive or blind devotion. This brings me to the second question. Does religious humanism need to be seen and experienced in a new way in this millennium of religious identity for us and for all those people out there seeking us? I'd say yes. In fact, it's going through radical change as we speak, and part of it is here. Our congregations who have not seen fit to change, in many cases, unfortunately, are dying. So one important change is to see religious humanism not as human, not as human-centered or human-centric. The humanist movement of the 1930s and 20s was really trying to move away from what they called superstition and theism and so on, and that's good. However, we human beings cannot egotistically believe we are the center of the universe anymore. We're learning better. All other sentient beings on this planet are part of the program. So humanism sounds just a bit egotistical. That's one. A second change I started to use the term ego deflation, but that didn't sound right. So let's just say resisting change. Second change is, how do we resist change? Another way of saying it is, religious humanism can be just a bit stubborn about holding on to its orthodox, shall we say, old values. Now, here I step aside to give you a quick story. As you know, I was in Maine this last week, and it was kind of a wild trip, but it was great. And I drove past a church where I had pre-candidated back in January of 2003. And in fact, it was another stormy weekend. It was a beautiful old church, and its members are rightly proud of it. But one of their major problems that they were experiencing in 2003 is that their membership was flat and the visitors never came back. And they couldn't quite figure out why. So when we had our preliminary phone interview, I said, well, why don't you surreptitiously find out what you're saying to your visitors? And maybe that'll tell you what's going on. So one of the search committee members surreptitiously took notes for several Sundays before I got there. This is how people were greeted. Variations. Greeter, hello, welcome. Visitor, thank you, and it's nice to be here. Now, next greeter, where are you from? Now, two possible answers here. If the visitor said, we are from here in this town, then the greeter was effusively welcoming. If, however, the visitor said, we are from another town, the response of the greeter was a slightly puzzled look and variations on, why are you here? Now, this is a classic New England response. So I wasn't surprised, but I asked the search committee how would they imagine it being a visitor. They looked astonished, and they said, but we've always done it that way. And my response was, exactly. We've always done it that way, in the larger picture, is a truism in many religious communities, no matter what their names. Now, let me say that I don't think you've got too much we've always done it here-itis here at UUFC. But I am reminded of that old joke which I read recently in a Unitarian Universalist humor magazine that says if any congregation has done something for more than 3 years, it automatically gets filed as we've always done it that way. Now, think for a moment of things that you've done here for a number of years, let's say more than 3, and assume that it's all good because no one seems to complain about it. Have you become complacent because no one has? Has the interim time been a good time to explore alternatives? Are there ones that you haven't explored yet, but it might be good to do? What might be some examples of such changes? Well, here are some. One is, I know some of you love conversation time after sermons. I think I've counted at least 6 people over the last year and a half who love it and cherish it. I can safely attest to at least 10 people who have equally come to me and despise it. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have to balance off those people who would really prefer to have conversation after the service for those who want to take part, and who said to me, I just want to chew over the ideas that are presented. I don't want people to be suddenly saying what their responses are. So whose priorities are the most important? Those who love conversation right after the sermon, or those who prefer to have it after the service for those who want it? Whose passion is the most important? Priorities and passions change. Is religious humanism here at this congregation more important than a source such as loving Jesus, or the source that talks about earth-centered spirituality? Priorities and passions change. So another part of change, I think, which ties into the conversation piece really in a way, is going to the larger question of, and I asked this some time ago, and Dick Danforth remembers it, are we a religious community? If so, are we entitled to use religious language? A significant outcome of the Unitarian side of our denomination, the Unitarian religious humanist movement, was to toss aside all or most religious language that might offend the refugee from traditional religious places. So, for example, words like God, Jesus, salvation, spirituality, and all these and more got tossed out the window because we just didn't want any part of them. They implied superstition and the supernatural. And I also spoke of hurts and pain from prior churches and communities. So what happened as a result is that we no longer took part in some of the great debate in the 20th century about the definition of religious words. And I think that's our great loss. Now, I'll give you an example. In fact, I'll give you two of them. One example is from last Sunday, during the Stump the Minister service. I was asked a two-part question. Do you believe in ghosts? And what role, if so, what role do you think ghosts can play in spiritual development? Well, I thought about that question during my drive north to Maine. Last Sunday, I talked about it as the post-death experience and the mystery of death. But I'm going to give you a different answer now. Yes, I believe in ghosts, and so do you. Why? When I went home to Maine and visited the farm, which is vacant right now, I remembered still some painful family experiences from the people that brought me up when I was a child. When I went by Penn State University a couple of days ago, I remembered a relationship from 40 years ago that still haunts me to this day, 40 years later. Are the people involved ghosts in the original sense or the traditional sense of sheets and moans and so on? No, of course not. But who among us has not had ghosts of past relationships or people who have hurt us or we hurt them? How do those memories carry with us through a lifetime? And are they an emotional haunting of our lives? The key here is to redefine the word ghost from the Halloween or supernatural to the real ones that dwell within every one of us. Wouldn't the same be true of religious language? Now, Lori last Sunday asked me a question about grace. Now, she may have meant grace with a big G, so we'll use that one. Grace with a big G, capital G, refers usually to God's grace as love and protection. And Amazing Grace, for example, that great song, is a good example of it. But here's another definition from the late theologian Paul Tillich. He says, grace, capital G, strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. Grace strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. Sometimes at that moment when grace appears, It is a wave of light breaking into our darkness. I'll read that again. Grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. It strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. And sometimes when grace strikes us, a wave of light breaks into our darkness. So we have two very different definitions. We have God gives grace to us, or grace comes to us in the dark times of life. A wave of light. Which definition works best for you? Doesn't matter. Both are right. So here's a suggestion for a revised religious humanism for the 21st century. Don't tiptoe around or avoid religious language. Instead, redefine it in a way that makes sense for people who are not interested in typical traditional religious dogma or demands, but who'd like to wrestle with the old words in new ways. And for those of you who are dutifully keeping notes, I will suggest Kathleen Norris's book, Amazing Grace, toward a vocabulary of faith. Now, what's the good point of this? Let's suppose you are having a friendly conversation with a person who is a strong Christian, and they very much want to convince you, maybe save you, and are talking about Jesus with you. And they're saying to you, do you love Jesus? With a new religious humanism, you wouldn't get ever so slightly uncomfortable. You would say, yes, I love Jesus. He was a great teacher and prophet, wasn't he? And then you walk away. No guilt. You've said the truth. And suddenly, you've cut off any desire to be saved at the knees. Now, one final way. One final way that I think religious humanism can be a force for the 21st century. By its very nature, religious humanism believed that all people were inherently of value and of rights and equality. And our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, every being, comes from that idea. Now, some of you know, I hope many of you know, that Pat Singoli over here and others in the campus ministry and interfaith groups did a stellar piece of work over the last almost 9 months or so, involving, first of all, a 9/11 event held at the university, but also then a what's called Lay Academy through the interfaith associations, where the Charter was discussed, the Charter for Compassion. The Charter for Compassion originated with historian Karen Armstrong. She meant it to be both secular and religious and neither, to go beyond both. It was going to be non-creedal and non-exclusive. It would speak to the abiding universal force of compassion, big C, in humanity. So, could this be part of a new religious humanism for the 21st century? I will propose to the Outreach Social Justice Committee at their next meeting that this congregation become partners with the Charter for Compassion, with other religious and secular groups around the world. I checked the list this morning at charterforcompassion.org, and there's no Unitarian Universalist group on there partnering. I think, wouldn't it be wonderful if this congregation became the first one? What a great idea. Because religious humanism isn't just about humans, or even just about humanity. It speaks every language in the world, including religious language. But foremost, I would say to us that it speaks the language of compassion, big C, in the world. It speaks it as a universalist faith, leaving no one out. Compassion applies to us all. It is moving beyond any idolatry, Unitarian Universalism, and, I think, religious humanism, that becomes a fringe movement of heretics. Because, in fact, what compassion starts doing is saying, we're all in it together. So I'm going to read 2 brief parts of the charter, and then we're going to sing We Would Be One. But I'm going to ask you, as you hear the words of this part of the charter, see if they resonate with your understanding of Unitarian Universalism as your faith. And 2, if you hear religious humanism in its new form in these words. And then 3, if so, is compassion and its spread part of our work in the world? The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us to always treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures and dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put one another there, and to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being, treating everyone without exception with absolute justice, equity, and respect. Last part. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. I would say that is religious humanism at its best. And I would also say it leaves no one out. So now let's stand and sing as we're able. Hymn number 318, We Would Be One.